Hey guys, I hope everybody's doing good out there. It's already March. It's hard to believe. Turkey season has kicked off here in the South, and it's my favorite time of year. But there's one more thing that we want to always talk about this time of year when spring rolls around, and we want to talk about spring and summer food plots. This is big at Tecomate. This is how we got started as a company with Lab, of course, and this is one of the things that we get the most questions about is spring and summer food plots. So we're just going to do a short video about really just the basics, just a spring summer food plot 101 type video, and just go over a few of the the different seed options and that type of thing, and hopefully this will help some of you guys out. So anytime you're considering planting a food plot, a spring, summer type food plot, or any food plot for that matter, you want to consider what are your goals for your property. So that's the first thing we want to talk about. So when it comes to spring and summer type food plots, the first goal that most people have in mind is I want to just grow the biggest deer that I can. I want to grow the biggest antlers that I can. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course. That's where those summer annuals come into play. Things like Lab, soybeans, that type of things that have really high protein. That's the first goal you can consider. The second one would be, do I just want to hold more deer on my property? If you plant summer annuals, spring food plots, you're going to hold more deer on your property. That's another goal to consider. Another goal to consider would be, do I want to provide food for other animals on my property? Turkeys, other game birds, that type of thing. Provide food and cover for them also throughout the whole year and not just the fall and the winter. Another goal that is not talked about quite as often, but I think is so important, is building your soil health. By planting anything in the summertime, you're going to help yourself throughout the fall. It's going to make that fall planting process a lot easier if you can get plants in the ground that are going to put nutrients into the ground. It's going to suppress weeds, it's going to suppress grass, that type of thing. So that's another goal to consider. Do you want to maximize your soil health throughout the summer? Absolutely. One thing that I always consider whenever I'm planting a spring summer food plot is maximizing soil health. So consider those things first. What are your goals for your property? And then we can move on from there on what we want to plant. All right, so we've talked about what our different goals are for our property. Now we want to consider what are the different seed options that are available out there to plant in the spring and the summer. So talking about spring planting, you're probably going to go with some type of perennial if you plant in the spring. The first thing that comes to mind whenever you talk about perennials is clover, of course. There are different varieties of clover out there. There are annuals and there are perennials. So I would probably go with some type of ladino, a white ladino type clover, a perennial type clover if you're going to plant in the spring. Another good one is chicory. That's another good perennial to plant in the spring. Another good one is alfalfa. One thing to consider with alfalfa is you have to have a really good pH to plant alfalfa, so just consider that. Make sure you take those soil tests. When you're planting anything, you want to take soil tests, but you really want to pay attention to that pH if you're going to plant alfalfa. Can I plant in the spring? Can I plant clover, chicory, alfalfa in the spring? I always get asked that. Where I'm at in Mississippi, I don't plant clover in the spring in Mississippi. I always tell people Middle Tennessee and North is the best for planting in the spring, planting perennials in the spring. And the reason for that is because where I'm at in the South, the further south you get, it gets hot quicker, of course, in the spring. So you have a shorter growing season for that clover to establish without all the weeds and grass suppression and that type of thing. Not to say you can't do it. I'm sure there's somebody listening to this who plants clover in the spring every year in the South, and they do fine. It's just usually you have better luck by planting it in the fall so that it can establish throughout the fall, and then you maintain it the next spring and the summer. All right, so that takes care of spring perennials. Next, we want to talk about summer annuals. The first one I want to talk about is Lab. Lab is super high protein. It's the plant that started Tecomate. Super high protein. Soybeans, another high protein summer annual. Another option is cowpeas. There's different varieties of cowpeas out there, of course, just like anything else. Super high protein also. Corn is another one. People plant corn every summer. Sorghum, sunflowers. Another one that's getting really popular in the South is joint vetch because of its graze tolerance. It grows up. It's kind of slow growing. It's not quite as preferred as, say, a soybean or a cowpea. However, the deer don't mow it to the ground. You can plant it in smaller food plots. So joint vetch is getting really popular in the South. Alice clover is another one that is a kind of a slow growing plant that you can plant in smaller summer food plots. Another one is sun hemp. That one doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but it's a really fast growing plant that's super high in protein, and it's really good for your soil. Buckwheat is another one. It's not super preferred by the deer, of course, like a soybean, lab, cowpea, that type of thing. However, it's really good for your soil. It suppresses weeds, it suppresses grass, that type of thing. It's a really good plant to sow small seeds into in the fall and kind of roll them down and do that no-till method that's getting really popular with everybody. So those are some of the summer annuals that you can consider. We could go down a rabbit hole and talk about each one of those, but those are just the options that you have. Depending on your property, the size of your food plots that you can plant, you want to consider. You don't want to go out and plant lab or soybeans in a half-acre food plot. The deer are going to mow it down in one night and it's going to be gone. But if you are planting smaller summer food plots, maybe you can consider some of those other things like joint vetch or Alice clover or buckwheat, that type of thing. All right, so we've talked about the different seed options that are available for the spring and the summer. The next thing we want to ask is what's best for my area. So a few things come to mind whenever I'm talking about what I want to plant for my particular area. Food and cover, screening, that type of thing. We want to ask all those questions. What am I trying to incorporate into my property? And that's going to tell me what plants I want to actually plant for my food plots. So food. If you want food there 365 days a year, you're going to have to incorporate some type of perennials. Now, whether you plant those in the spring and the fall, depending on where you're at, what region of the country you're in, that doesn't matter. But if you're wanting to incorporate a lot of food into your property, I always tell people I like to have 50% perennials, and then the other 50% of my food plots, I'd like to have summer and fall annuals rotated. The next thing you want to talk about maybe for your summer food plots, if you want to incorporate some type of cover into those summer food plots. Maybe if you're wanting to incorporate some type of cover, maybe you don't want just soybeans or just lab or just cowpeas, that type of thing. Maybe you want to incorporate some sorghum or some millet or some sunflowers or sun hemp, that type of thing into them, so that it creates a really thick wall of cover within those summer food plots so that the deer are spending 24 hours a day there. The next thing is the screening type products that, we have a product called Blockade that grows up really tall. You would establish those in the late spring and the summer so that they have time to grow, so that they can hide those blinds and hide your food plots from those public roadways and that type of thing during the fall and the winter. Next thing you want to consider is how much acreage do I have to plant. That's really important when it comes to the things like soybeans and lab and that type of thing. I know in some parts of the South, we want to consider deer density also along with the total acreage that I have. We have so many deer in some parts of the South that I wouldn't plant less than 10 acres of soybeans or lab just because the deer would come in there and mow them down. So you want to think about total food plot acreage along with deer density. That's two other key factors of what you want to plant for your spring and summer food plots. The next thing is location, of course. We talked about earlier how there are some parts of the country that I wouldn't feel comfortable planting clover in the spring. So location is a big thing. It also plays into when you can plant those summer annuals. So location is another thing you want to consider. The next thing maybe is what are your neighboring crops? If your neighbor is planting 50 acres of corn, you probably don't want to go plant 1 acre of corn on your property. Maybe you want to do something different like soybeans. The next thing is the equipment that you have. That's something you want to consider no matter what time of year you're planting food plots. But you always want to consider what type of equipment you have, what can you plant. And there's always something that you can plant. I always tell people with a little bit of work, you can always plant something. Maybe you can't plant the summer annuals, the bigger seeds, but maybe you can frost seed some clover into a small food plot on your property. So there's always something that you can do, no matter what type of equipment you have, but it is something to consider on what you're going to plant on your property. All right, so we talked about what I want to plant in my area. We talked about the different seed options that are available and the goals that we have for our particular property. So when should I plant them? That's a big question that we get all the time. When should I plant? Well, that's going to vary a lot depending on where you're at across the country. So it's going to vary by location, it's going to vary by the type of seed, and it's going to vary by, of course, the temperature in your particular area. And that's going to go back to the location, of course. So all things considered, you have to look at the type of seed. You can plant clover in the spring maybe, but maybe you're going to have to wait till those ground temperatures warm up to 60, 65 degrees before I can plant soybeans or corn or that type of thing. So all things considered, you just have to look at the location where you're at across the country, the type of seed, and really pay attention to those temperatures whenever you're looking at when I want to plant my spring summer food plots. But one thing to consider about spring and summer food plots is that there is some maintenance that goes along with them. If you plant clover, you're going to have to maintain it. If you have a perennial, clover, chicory, alfalfa, it does take some type of maintenance. You're going to have to either spray them with herbicides. You may have to do a little mowing every now and then. Mowing is not my preferred method of maintaining clover or chicory. However, sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes you have to knock the tops off of some weeds or that type of thing. But preferably, I would go out and take care of grasses first with clethodim, maybe. And then maybe to take care of those weeds, maybe I'm spraying a 2,4-DB or a Mizomox or something like that to get rid of those weeds and grass and that type of thing, so that clover and chicory and alfalfa or whatever it may be, so that it can thrive and it doesn't get choked out by those native grasses or native weeds. I hope that gives you some ideas on maybe something you can incorporate into your own property with a spring and summer food plot. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at Tecomate.com. We'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have, and we appreciate you guys watching the video.
If you liked this episode and want to follow along on our hunts, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you know when we post, and you can check out more of the Tecomate life.